Today's episode has been brought to you by Schedulicity.
And also by Pelvic Health Professionals. This is a place where you can connect to the most up-to-date information about pelvic health topics while learning alongside a supportive community. One member recently shared some feedback. They said, "I find this a great resource for finding information tailored to a specific issue. I also appreciate that Pelvic Health Professionals addresses social issues and marginalized sections of society." One way I like to describe Pelvic Health Professionals when people ask me is I like to say it's like Netflix for pelvic health, only better. If you're wanting to check it out, visit pelvichealthprofessionals.com. Hello and welcome to the Connected Yoga Teacher Podcast. I'm your host, Shannon Crow. I use she, her pronouns, and a fun fact about me, I really dislike lawn care and anything to do with a lawn. Yes, I have a lawn. I just don't see the point of it, and I think it might be a point of frustration for my neighbors. I really enjoy gardening and growing vegetables and flowers. I like growing things that feed people, insects, the planet, and I would love to hear from you. If you are a fellow lawn disliker, maybe you love your lawn and you figured out how to have a lawn that looks amazing. Maybe you have lawn alternatives. If you have any of those things, come and hang out and connect with me over on Instagram. If you look for the Connected Yoga Teacher, you'll find me. If you're new here, I'm a mom of three, a yoga teacher, podcaster, and founder of Pelvic Health Professionals. And this podcast was created for you so that each and every week you are connected to the information and inspiration that will support you as you build your really unique yoga business. Today's episode is one that I have wanted to put together for a long time now because I have personal experience with pelvic girdle pain, which I used to call hip pain. For over 20 years now, I've dealt with this in my own body, in my own yoga practice, and also I specialize and teach about pelvic health, I think, because of the way I've dealt with my own pelvic girdle pain. And for me, things really started to click when I started to learn about pelvic health and reach outside of the yoga world and connect with pelvic health PTs and kind of the latest research that we have around pelvic health. So I wanted to provide some of that information for you today in this mini training. So it's a mini training because it's a podcast. I know you're probably busy on the go. Maybe you're walking or running or cleaning or out in a boat somewhere. Who knows what you're doing, but a lot of the time people are listening on the go. Now, if you want to dive in further on this, there is a full training. I created it. It's available. It's online now. It's on demand. And you can sign up for it over at pelvichealthprofessionals.com, or you can join the Pelvic Health Professionals membership and it's included, which actually is a little bit of a better deal. I'll tell you more about where you can find that exactly, and we'll also link to it in the show notes. But for now, I just want to dig in and share some things that really help. These are things that have helped me. These are things that have helped other yoga students, and I want to kind of package it up together so that you have something to try out when you're having quote unquote hip pain. We're going to get in and talk about that, or if your yoga students are. Now, before we dive right in, I have a few thank yous that I want to share. I want to give a shout out to our sponsor, Schedulicity. Let's hear our hot tip of the week from the team over there.
Hello, Connected Yoga Teachers. This is Ren with the Schedulicity Hot Tip of the Week. Once you have an email and content strategy, Schedulicity makes it a breeze to commit and follow through. The client communications tool allows you to send email messages to your clients and use their Schedulicity booking history to filter them into groups. It's never been easier to target your emails and market directly to the people who are most interested in your content. Keep that personal touch without sacrificing your personal time.
Thank you so much, Team Schedulicity, for bringing the podcast to all of our yoga teachers and also for helping us to keep our calendar super organized with your booking software. I also want to share a big thank you to Liza, who sent an email saying, "Hi, Shannon. It's been such a wild year. I'm a young childhood educator and have only now just been able to dive into the pelvic health professionals' videos and Thinkific content. And I just wanted to send a note to say, wow, thank you so much. I'm loving the information and the different speakers. I've been telling everyone I can about what you're building. For now, I'm only able to indulge while my son takes naps, but I'm excited to dive into the yoga course and to continue to mine these amazing video interviews. Just thank you so much. The work you're doing is amazing. Much love and gratitude, Liza." Oh my goodness, Liza, thank you so much for taking the time to send this email. It was a really bright spot in my day. I always love to hear feedback like this, of course. And also thank you so much for sharing the membership with other people and saying that it's really helping you. That is our goal 100% inside of Pelvic Health Professionals. So that just makes my day on every level. So let's dive into this mini training on hip pain. I want to get sharing what I know as a yoga teacher, a pelvic health professional, and a person with a pelvis who had 3 babies and then experienced the pain of pelvic girdle pain and went to a lot of different people about it and didn't really find comfort for a long time. So hopefully, if you're listening to this podcast and you've experienced pelvic pain, or if your students do, I'm hoping that it just really helps you. So to start, let's define some things and ask some questions. My first question for you is, have you ever experienced physical pain in your body? And I mean anywhere in your body. I actually don't know anyone who would answer no to this, but I don't want to assume that everyone understands what pain feels like. And I want to dive in a little bit further and ask you, have you experienced acute pain and persistent pain? So acute pain is like when we touch a hot surface or you sprain your ankle and oh my goodness, it hurts right in the moment and it hurts recent. Whenever something happens in the body. Or have you experienced persistent pain? Does it go beyond 11, 12 weeks or longer than that? Now, I'm not going to get right into pain science today because this is a topic that we have covered a lot on the podcast with different guest speakers. And so I will link to those in our show notes. And also make sure you subscribe to the podcast because in the next 2 weeks, we are going to hear from Shelley Prosco and Neil Pearson, both pain science experts. When you're subscribed to the podcast, you get the episode as soon as it comes out. So the moment it comes out, you have it in your podcast app player thingy. Okay, so most humans know what pain has felt like, so I don't want to go into that topic. For now, just make note of the terms acute and persistent and really keep that in the back of your mind for a moment. Many of our yoga students are talking about their hip pain, and before we get into what and where this pain is, let's first think of things that you might have said or you might hear from your yoga students or your friends or some healthcare professionals about the hips. And you might even want to press pause for a minute here on the podcast to even jot some things down because as we get into this discussion, it's really great if you can come at this with a fresh perspective. Like, what are some of the messages that you have heard about the hips? What are some of the messages that you have said? What have your students said? What have your friends said? What have you heard from other people? Maybe yoga teacher training, you heard something about the hips. So if you're going to pause, here's the spot. And if not, then I'm going to go ahead and share some with you that I have heard or said in my lifetime. So just to clarify, these are things I've heard or said. These are not like truths. I'm not saying they're myths. I'm just saying they are messages, and I'm not putting any judgment on them yet. My pelvis is so loosey-goosey since pregnancy. It must be the relaxin. My SI joint is out of place. Twists are bad for me. They hurt my SI joint. My hip goes out of place when I do triangle pose. What are your best poses for tight hips? I sit all day long and then my hip flexors tighten and I can't stand up properly for a while. I can't squat anymore because of my hips. My chiropractor told me that I have one leg that's longer than the other, and this is why my hips hurt. My SI joint is unstable. I have so much hip pain. What yoga is good for that? So if you have ever said or heard any of these things, you are in the right place right now. This mini training is really going to help you to understand this very broad topic. And most important, it's going to help you feel empowered to move and lead your yoga students when they're dealing with this type of pain. So I have a list of try these things out in your own practice. Offer these to your students then when you feel comfortable with them near the end of today's episode. Okay, next thing I'd like you to do is place your hands on your hips. And where are your hands in terms of the anatomical landmarks right now? If you're brave, take a quick photo and you can share that with me. You can send it to me in a private message on Instagram, or you could post it in the Connected Yoga Teacher Facebook group. I would love that so much if I could see, okay, here I am with my hands on my hips. And try this out with some friends or family, maybe people who live in your household or your yoga students the next time you meet up with them. When you say hands to your hips, where do they place them? Oftentimes we hear cues in a yoga class asking us to bring our hands to our hips or hands to our hip bones. And most people bring the hands to the very top of the pelvis, to the ilium. I'm sure in my phys ed classes in elementary school, that is what my teacher meant when she said, bring your hands to your hips, everyone. That's where she was aiming for us to bring our hands to the ilium bone, that top of the pelvis. And I don't hear many people saying, bring your hands to your ilium bones. And I think it would be confusing, honestly. I think if we cued this in a general yoga class, students would just look around and not know where to put their hands. And I'm not sure if it's that useful to really outline where are we putting our hands. Okay, they're on the ilium bones, and that's what I'm going to say now if I want them at the very top of the pelvis. So hold that in mind for a moment. And the next question is, where is your hip joint? Can you point to your hip joints? And why does all of this even matter? Why is Shannon talking about this when she said, okay, I'm going to do yoga for hip pain? What does this have to do with hip pain? Basically, it boils down to over the years when yoga students have come to me and said, I have hip pain, I ask them to point to where they feel the pain. I don't repeat it and say, where do you feel the hip pain? I just say, can you show me where you're feeling the pain? And some students will point to their low back or their sacrum or their SI joint area. Some won't even know how to answer you. They'll kind of stand there for a moment. That's okay. It's all okay. Some will describe what the pain feels like or tell you about when it happens, like what they're doing when they feel the pain. Some will point to their actual hip joints or the top of the pelvis or just like a general pelvic region. I'm not sure where they're really saying that the pain is. And all of this is really great information. The key to serving your yoga students is to ask more questions. You do not need to know all of the answers. Your students are the only person who's living in their body, and they're the only one who can actually know the answers. So for sure, we can educate ourselves and we can educate our students and empower them to move, especially when we get to understand pelvic girdle pain and the different issues that people have with the pelvis. But I want to explain why I don't say hip pain to my students anymore. I say pelvic girdle pain, and here's why. The most common places that people point to when they're talking about hip pain, quote unquote hip pain or pelvic pain, are the sacroiliac joint, also known as the SI joint, the coccyx, also known as the tailbone, the pubic symphysis, also known as the pubic bone, where the acetabulum meets the head of the femur, also known as the hip joint or the hips, or the entire pelvic area, including the lower abdomen, the pelvis, the perineum, and think about the people who are dealing with endometriosis, IBS, painful bladder syndrome, or any other issues that occur in the pelvic region. So that's 5 places that I generally hear about pelvic pain. And I'll make sure that these are listed in the show notes for you. So we're taking the notes for you. If you're on the go, you do not have to be trying to write this down somewhere quickly. We've got the notes for you over at theconnectedyogateacher.com/225. That actually reminds me to remind you, someone was asking me the other day, how do I find that episode that you did on blah, 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 whatever topic it was? And I said, honestly, the quickest way for even me to find an episode is just to go to our website, theconnectedyogateacher.com, go to the search bar and search for the term. So if you're like, what was that episode? It was about hip pain. Honestly, type in hip pain and you will come to this episode. Okay, I think another really important note here is that I just want to clarify that I don't walk around correcting yoga students or teachers or friends about the proper anatomical terms to use. And the reason why we have this confusion, in my opinion, is because the hip bone is a term that's commonly used in both anatomy and our day-to-day conversation. So that's like when we say put your hands on your hips, that can be defined as the hip bone. When someone gets a hip replacement, this is all about the hip joint. So it is confusing and it's complex, especially when we're working with really unique bodies. But I just want to highlight here that I am not then, if someone came to me and they said, I'm dealing with hip pain, I'd be like, I wouldn't say, okay, well, first of all, we're not going to call it that. I would just listen. And if it ever came to the point where I was going to talk about the pain and I felt like it was necessary to say where it is, I might say pelvic pain. And if I'm talking to PTs or those more so in the medical world, I would definitely refer to it as pelvic girdle pain. I just want to clarify that I'm not walking around correcting my students and I'm not walking around trying to get them to say pelvic girdle pain instead of hip pain. It just feels like that's not my job in this area. My job is to really listen to them, find out the information, ask them the questions, and then see how we can work together with movement and breath. And then, of course, all of the other aspects of yoga. But where I start is generally with movement and breath, where people feel like, okay, this is what I came for. So in a yoga class, in a typical yoga class, I have heard lots and lots of teachers use cues like hinge from the hips or find a neutral pelvis or square the hips. And I would love to hear your thoughts on this, actually. You can either share in the comments at theconnectedyogateacher.com/225, or you can also join in a conversation that's been happening in the Facebook group. Actually, as I was getting ready to record this episode, I just put a question out there, and I'll link to that in the show notes, where connected yoga teachers are really sharing their thoughts on language that we use around hips and the cues that we use for students and what we're really going for in that. It's a fascinating conversation. I kind of thought, I'll pull a couple of things from the thread and bring them into the podcast, but it's massive already, and I just posted it today. So instead, I'm going to link to it, and you can check it all out, read through it there. So just to recap, ask your yoga students 2 questions when they start talking about hip pain or pelvic pain. Question number 1, how long have you felt this pain? So this is where we're trying to see, is this acute? Like, did something happen? Or is this persistent pain? Number 2 is, where is the pain? Can you point to it? Can you show me where you feel the pain? And then that might lead into other questions for sure. There's lots of questions, but those are the 2 that I would definitely make sure that are included at the beginning. And another really important question is, are you seeing a PT, a physiotherapist, or if you're in the US or somewhere else, physical therapist, or other healthcare professional about this pain? I do this so often that sometimes I feel like a broken record, but I just want to say that it's so important. I feel it's very important as yoga teachers that we know our scope of practice, and that as we work alongside the healthcare team, we really know what our role is, because we have an important role to play. And that is a whole other podcast. I know I talked about it more in episode 73, where I talked about the 8 limbs of yoga, and I cover it more in the pelvic girdle pain training. And we definitely talk about referrals and making those connections with healthcare providers inside of pelvic health professionals. Now, if you're at the point where you're like, I just want to sign up for this training on pelvic girdle pain, and I want to practice all the things, know all the things, like I said, it's on demand. It's $47 US and worth every single penny. If you are dealing with pelvic girdle pain, or if you have yoga students who are coming to you and they're talking about hip pain, I highly recommend this training. It's 2 hours. It's absolutely packed with information. And the people who have gone through and taken this training have actually said, okay, I'm using this right away. I'm actually seeing differences in my own body, or I'm hearing from yoga students that this is making a big difference. The other thing that ties into this scope of practice, the really amazing thing for us as yoga teachers, is it is not our job. It is not in our scope of practice to diagnose pain. This isn't our role as yoga educators. It isn't our role unless we are also a PT or an MD. It's not our role at all as yoga teachers. And that really can relieve some of the pressure. Now, yes, it's great to understand the difference between, SI joint pain and sciatica, for sure. Sciatic pain or sciatica and SI joint pain are very different things. And I go in depth on both of those in the pelvic girdle pain training. But in my experience, there are just basics that are nice to know overall, and you don't even need to know all of the details of those if you're not ready to take that in yet. So as part of that recap, remember how I said that we are going to ask the question about how long this has been happening, and also that this has a lot to do with pain science. I would say those are 2 areas that you could dive in more to, like learn about persistent pain. And I'll link to the episode that we did with Shelley Prosco, where language really matters. So instead of calling it chronic pain, we might call it persistent pain. Also learn about pain science. So I'll link to all of our pain episodes that we have. And number 3 here is understand that the pelvis is strong and stable. Now, when I say that, I wonder what your initial reaction is. Have you heard otherwise? And if you have, one thing I really like to do when I can get together in person with people is to pass around my pelvic model and to get people to hold it and to feel how strong and stable it is, and then to talk about how strong and stable it is. And if I could wave a magic wand just in the world, but especially in the yoga and the PT world, I would wave my magic wand and start with the language that I hear everyone saying about the pelvis. We know that this is one of the strongest places in the body. And remember how I was saying all of those things that we have either heard or said about the pelvis, how it might be feeling like it's loosey-goosey or wobbly or unstable, or it goes out of place. This is where I would really dig into your belief system. If you have been told those things about your body, if you believe this is the way the pelvis works, we just know and understand. The medical world, the science world knows that this is one of the strongest places in the body, and it's very, very stable. It takes a lot to move the pelvis. Now, saying that and having the lived experience of persistent pelvic pain, I know that it can be sensitive and protective. And I don't want to say like, oh, it's all in your head, or it's super strong and stable, and so you must be making this up. No, not at all. The pelvis definitely has times where it is more sensitive and protective. Dr. Sinead Dufour talked about this, and I have her to thank for this language in a podcast episode And also I wrote an article on this for Yoga Anytime, so I'll link to both of those in the show notes. This language made a huge difference in my own body, in my own experience with my pelvic girdle pain. So I absolutely used to think that my pelvis was quote unquote wobbly and unstable. And I went to a few body workers who used language that shared similar beliefs along that line. And I created quite a story about my pelvis over the years. And shifting that mindset wasn't just like snapping my fingers and now I think something different. It took some time. And I needed to learn some new things about the pelvis and about pain. And I needed to really unlearn some things that I had been told about my pelvis. So now that we have that all covered, where we're learning about persistent pain and we get to know and understand pain science, and also that the pelvis is strong and stable, and we're looking at our scope of practice, the next thing, let's dive into the really juicy meat of this, where what are some of the things that we can do when we're experiencing pelvic girdle pain? When the pelvis is sensitive and protective, what can we do? So I pulled from the list that I use in the pelvic girdle pain training, and I chose the ones that I feel like I can talk through without needing to demo something. But if you're wanting to really dive in and learn and teach the flows, the movements, the breath practices, I would say dive into the full training and try them out. But I'm going to do my best to share some with you so that you have some in your tool belt. So here's the list that we're going to go through. And again, remember, we take the notes for you, so they're there. Exhale on the effort, space for your sits bones, S breath, question Kegels, rolling over, side to side standing, walking backwards, and symmetrical movements. Now today I can offer try these out. And if you want to understand more along the lines of why does this work the way it does, so that you can then take that and use it in different flows and different poses in your classes, that's included in the 2-hour training. But let's try some of these out. First one, exhale on the effort. So next time you do something like bridge pose in your yoga class, try exhaling on the effort and tell me, what do you notice? Then add an S breath. So make the sound like the letter S as you do bridge pose. So lifting on the exhale, you're going to make the sound S, and then you'll lower back down on the inhale. And how does that change your bridge pose? So try that, play around with it. Maybe go back to doing inhale as you lift into your bridge, and then try it again with the exhale and the S breath. And that's matching the exhale to the effort. Now, if you wanted to do something that's in your day-to-day life, let's say you're reaching over to pick up bags of groceries, try exhaling on the effort as you do that movement. Where's the most effort? Try exhaling on that effort. Another one is space for the sits bones. So how can you move your feet or your knees if you're in table pose to make more space between your sits bones? Or as you do your cat-cow, how can you find more space between your sits bones? Another great place to notice this space or lack of space is when you go to sit down. Are you tucking or untucking your tailbone as you go to sit down? I've worked with many yoga students who the moment they go to sit down, they think, okay, it's going to hurt, and you can see them physically tucking their tailbone, because that's something that we do automatically when we think we're going to have pain. So see if you can untuck your tailbone as you sit down and notice, how does that change things? Okay, here is one that is really literally many podcast episodes, and we have some podcast episodes about Kegels and the pelvic floor, but this one is question Kegels. So let's say you're experiencing pelvic girdle pain. First of all, I would highly suggest that you go see a pelvic health PT, because they can tell you if your pelvic floor needs to be doing Kegels right now or not. And they will tell you, hopefully in different positions, are you doing a Kegel properly? They're the person who can assess this. So I'll make sure, like I said, to link to more podcast episodes that focus on pelvic floor. And what we know about the pelvic floor is that it needs to be able to lengthen in order to strengthen. And sometimes Kegels are offered like, oh, this'll fix it. If you have something going on in your pelvic area, do Kegels. That's the answer. And just imagine if the pelvic floor is holding a lot of tension already, strengthening or tightening those muscles more is not the answer. That could actually make pelvic girdle pain or low back pain worse. Now, there's a couple of things here that I just cannot imagine trying to cue through an audio-only podcast, and that's our slow sunrise and rolling over. So there's this really special way to roll over. I learned it from Dr. Sinead Dufour. It's hard to explain audio only, but there is a demo of it in the pelvic girdle pain training. And I'm not sure, but I think possibly it's in the episode that we did with Dr. Sinead Dufour on pelvic girdle pain. Now, one that you can easily do when you feel pelvic girdle pain when you're standing. So when you feel like, oh gosh, my hips are aching, or I just feel this discomfort in my low back or my pelvis, try this one out. Try mindfully moving from side to side. So standing at center, take an inhale and feel, all right, where is my sturdy position? Where do I want to place the feet? And then on the next exhale, press into one heel as you shift the weight to that foot, just slightly. Inhale back to center, and as you exhale, press into the other heel as you shift over towards that foot. It's really subtle. Just repeat it. Notice, can you bring the breath into this movement? Is one side feeling different, or do they both feel the same? Does it decrease that pain sensation? Does it slowly over time? So we're always going for something that decreases that pain sensation. If you're like, oh, I got to do this and then the pain increases, I would say try something else. Another one to try while you're standing is walking backwards. So how does it feel for the pelvis and all of the muscles around it to walk backwards? And I would try and incorporate this when you can safely. Please don't do this in traffic. Try walking backwards though, and just see, how does this feel? And the last one here, the one that I think can be almost create too much controversy sometimes, but also is honestly my go-to. When my pelvis is having a sensitive and protective day, this is my go-to. And that is to switch out all of your asymmetrical movements with symmetrical movements. Now, this isn't forever. And to be very clear, like if you want to go upstairs or you want to walk or do all kinds of things, you're doing asymmetrical movements. So I don't want you to start walking around like a penguin. I want you to notice, okay, pain is increasing right now. My pelvis is feeling sensitive and protective today. And so in my yoga practice, for example, I might take out all of my warriors and triangles and add in a symmetry sequence. And there is a symmetry sequence, a PDF, and the Audible that I did in a podcast episode. It is my absolute go-to. It's my absolute favorite. And that sequence originally came from the work of Dr. Cecile Ross. So Dr. Sinead Dufour took that, modified it, and we have a copy, a PDF for you online. I would love to hear from you, connected yoga teachers. Try this out in your own practice and let me know, what do you notice? Once you've tried this out, you really feel confident in these movements, then you can start to incorporate them into your yoga class. Imagine that you bring everyone to stand in mountain. You could definitely bring them into that side to side, bringing the weight to one heel and then the other with this really mindful movement. And you might start to talk about how this is something that people can try when they're feeling like pain in the pelvic area when they're standing. It's great for people who are on their feet all day. You can go into some of that information there with them. But the very first thing is to try it out in your own body and really feel like you're comfortable with the movements. And if you have thoughts or questions about anything in today's episode, please share that on our show notes page over at theconnectedyogateacher.com/225. And if you want to dive in, like I said, you want to really try these out and have me lead you through them and really lead you through the why are we doing this? Like, why does this even work? That's what I like to know. You can head on over to pelvichealthprofessionals.com. And like I said, you could decide, okay, I'm going to join the membership and the training. That pelvic girdle pain training is actually included in there in the membership. Plus, you have all kinds of ongoing learning that you get to check out. There's two options for the membership. There's an annual and a monthly. Or you could say, no, I'm just signing up for the pelvic girdle pain training. That's what I want to dive into and learn today. Or maybe you feel like I've got enough information from this podcast episode alone, and I'm going to go with that for now. I hope this helps. It has been a lot of years working with my own body, the movement and pain experts that I've learned from, and with students who have been dealing with pelvic girdle pain. They've also been great teachers. And I came up with this simplified list. Try these things when you have pelvic girdle pain. And I love to do that. I love to make a list, to simplify things, to have okay, here are the action steps. But I also know that each individual is so unique and humans are very complex beings. And so the goal is to try it out, modify it to suit your needs, modify it for your students, and just get rid of anything that doesn't serve you. Thank you so much for being here all the way until the end of today's episode. And also a huge thank you to our entire team for making this podcast possible. And my final question for you as we close things out, I want to know, what will you be doing this week to stay connected to yourself, your yoga practice, and to your community so that you can share the yoga that lights you up?